assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, there is no end. But I think at last a book has been done which has about it the stamp of authority, and a book which advances the analysis considerably further than has been the case for the last 10 years. That book is by Anthony Summers, an investigative reporter for the British Broadcasting Corporation, who's had access to the full files of the House Committee on Assassination, which conducted the most recent investigation of the JFK assassination, and has as well been chasing around this country and elsewhere in the world, talking to all sorts of people who have some connection with the history of that assassination. Anthony Summers titles his new book Conspiracy. He is quite convinced, and he has convinced me as I've been reading his book, that the assassination was not the act of a lone, crazed person, namely Oswald, that Oswald did figure in it, but quite possibly as a patsy, and that some sort of conspiracy does lie behind that dreadful act on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. We'll get right into that analysis and get his argument and his evidence after the usual update on the evening's news.
Here's Milt Rosenberg.
And here is Anthony Summers, a brilliant young reporter for the British Broadcasting Corporation, who has, in the last few years, been chasing down everything he can find on the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and all of that is now brought together in an excellently crafted new book titled Conspiracy, a book of which a number of people comment most favorably. One of them is Robert McNeil, the executive editor of the McNeil-Lehrer Report, who says Summers' argument is so lucidly arranged and so forcefully mounted that I now feel compelled to believe that there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Earlier tonight, when I was talking with Bob Collins, I read the longer comment by Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, one of the leading historians in the world, who is quite convinced after the reading of this book that it is now demonstrated that a conspiracy did in fact occur and did in fact dispatch our president to whatever reward awaited him beyond this vale of tears. Anthony, I want to get directly in it by taking the conclusion before we get to the evidence. Can you summarize for us what you are now persuaded of, what you are now convinced of with regard to the nature of the assassination of John Kennedy?
Thank you for being so generous about the book and for mentioning the people who have said that I seem to have got it right, or at least not to have got it wrong in quite as many areas as some of the many people who've written books about this before may have done. I've called the book Conspiracy flatly, not because I, as an author or reporter, believe that there was a conspiracy, but because, and I do incline to that view, that's clear, but because last year, although given the media's rather lazy treatment of the matter, I think the American public could be forgiven for not knowing it. The fact is that last year a congressional committee, which you all paid for to the tune of $6 million, told us that there was a scientific basis for believing that there were two gunmen in Dealey Plaza. And if there were two gunmen in Dealey Plaza, unless you're like the irresponsible editor of a leading newspaper who allowed an editorial to pass that said, so what, two gunmen in Dealey Plaza, couldn't they both have been lone gunmen firing within the same few seconds within 100 yards of each other? Which I think
rather like the 10 monkeys, if you sit them down, will ultimately type out the full Encyclopedia Britannica. But
or the Bible, yeah.
Or the Bible.
No, in fact, the committee said that there were two gunmen in Dealey Plaza. They based that conclusion on the scientific statement that it was a 95% scientific certainty that there was a gunman to the front of the president and at least one gunman to his rear. Now, when they said 95% certain, the press mocked the committee and mocked the scientific findings. They said, well, what about the other 5%? I need to explain that, because a lot of people have been misled on this. If I take this cup and drop it on the floor, you and I would say that it's 100% certain that it's going to hit the floor. Scientists won't. They'll put it in the high 90s because they're scientists. And the point is that the chief scientific advisor to the committee on this area said on oath that if he were a lawyer, he would put it as beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a second gunman at work on the day of the assassination. Beyond a reasonable doubt. and he was queried very carefully on that by the congressman, is, of course, the standard that we apply in our courts to make vital decisions in justice. And we must now accept that there were two gunmen.
And that is the opening wedge to a reinvestigation of the whole matter. The evidence of a fourth shot fired, the estimate is, indeed from the so-called grassy knoll, and thus at least two gunmen, the one in the book depository window and the one at the grassy knoll, and thus if two are coordinating their efforts at killing a man, that is a conspiracy. I pressed you a moment ago, and I'm going to do it again, for the ultimate conclusion toward which you tend, which has to do with a good deal more than just two men engaged in a conspiracy, which might have been limited to two, but rather a conspiracy which, as you now reconstruct it, and of which you are now persuaded, reaches out to involve many other men and a number of different institutions. Would you state that overall conclusion, only to put it on the table, and then we'll go after the evidence supportive of that conclusion?
Yes, I would, although I would say that my book is not a speculative book. It's a book about evidence. I hope it's a reporter's book, and therefore I haven't come to a conclusion as such. The publishers have plucked from the meat of my text the following sentence and put it on the cover, and I think it's sensible to quote that. It is certainly possible that a renegade element in U.S. intelligence, and I stress renegade element in U.S. intelligence, manipulated Oswald, whatever his role on November the 22nd, 1963. That same element in U.S. intelligence may have activated pawns in the anti-Castro movement and the mafia to murder the president and subsequently to execute Oswald, the alleged assassin. Now, that sounds very complex. We're talking about three forces: the mob, the anti-Castro movement, which means the anti-Castro exiles, and one must also look at the U.S. intelligence people who were deeply involved with both the mob and the anti-Castro people at that time. It's not as complex as it sounds, nor is it contradictory. All those three forces were in bed together at the time in the efforts to topple Fidel Castro, and indeed specifically in plots to assassinate Fidel Castro.
And though you see a tripartite possible conspiracy, U.S. intelligence, an element of it, not the whole CIA under orders from the director, but some renegade element probably within CIA, the mob, and anti-Castro refugees based in Miami and elsewhere. So you see those three groups as possibly involved.
On the evidence, there are links between Oswald, between the events of that period, and between Ruby and people in those areas.
But you do suggest that they weren't equally involved in the sense that the U.S. intelligence element in the operation was manipulating the other two groups.
Yes, I've indicated that as a possibility. I think the most important thing, we have a number of people who wanted to do away with President Kennedy, or perhaps to put it better, would have liked to see President Kennedy no longer in the White House. And I'm sure we'll get into the motives a little further on. But the important thing to see here is that I make a distinction. I think that during his adult life, Oswald clearly crossed paths with, and I believe was used by, at one stage perhaps unwittingly, at a later stage I think, and I'm pretty sure, wittingly, he was used by one of the tentacles of the octopus of U.S. intelligence.
The intelligence tentacle, in fact.
Right. But that, of course, does not necessarily predicate a U.S. intelligence involvement in the assassination. However, there is specific evidence concerning the weeks and months just before the assassination, which does suggest to me in a disquieting fashion, but quite apart from having had a previous connection with Oswald, that an element of U.S. intelligence may indeed have been involved in the conspiracy, using people in the mob and people in the anti-Castro movement as the hitmen and as its pawns.
Well, let's turn now to an examination of some of the evidence. The evidence is rich and complex, and it's developed fully in a tightly written and rather lengthy book. Excellently written, I want to attest, and captivating on every page. And we can't develop all of that evidence or recapitulate all of it in this conversation. But let me suggest that we might pick up by talking about Oswald and his contacts, his early contacts and continuing contacts with that renegade element in U.S. intelligence. And what you've got to get into now, it seems to me, is a somewhat more precise definition of what element in U.S. intelligence you're talking about, and what evidence is on record, or what data have you been able to dig up about Oswald's connection with that renegade element in the days or years preceding November 22nd, 1963?
I think, if I may, we have to go back rather a long way and look at Oswald's career, which people who have watched the case a little, and even some who know just a little about the thing, are vaguely familiar with. Oswald grew up in New Orleans. He joined the Marines. He left the Marines. He went to the Soviet Union at the end of the 1950s, October 1959, spent 2 years in the Soviet Union. There he found himself a Soviet wife, Marina, and he brought her back to the United States. They moved to Texas and to the Fort Worth area, in fact, then subsequently to the Dallas area. Then in the vital months, so far as evidence is concerned, before the assassination, the summer of 1963, they were in New Orleans. Oswald then went on to Mexico City on a visit in which he purportedly, applied for a visa to go to Cuba, communist Cuba, and then Oswald went back to Dallas, and then the assassination happened. Now, through that period, we have to look at whether the public posture of Oswald as a young Marxist convert, a sort of socialist zealot, is the true picture or not. People have long raised questions about this, and
we do remember that in New Orleans, in the months before the assassination, he was passing out pro-Castro literature on the streets of New Orleans. He managed to wind up on a radio program, I suppose not totally unlike the one that we're doing right now, in which he spoke for the pro-Castro cause.
Yes, if you like, we'll take then the New Orleans period first. This is the period at which I think that the evidence suggests strongly that by this time he was a witting tool of U.S. intelligence, or one branch of it. Oswald handed out his pro-Castro leaflets in the street, and on one occasion he got into a tussle with anti-Castro exiles who clearly disapproved of what he was doing, supporting Castro. It was a little street incident, and it led to, as you say, to a radio program, to newspaper coverage, to television coverage, all of which in the end, in the temper of the times, in the context of New Orleans in 1963, tended to discredit and smear the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which Oswald said he was representing. Now, take another look at his leftist posture there. Oswald wrote to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the leftist people, reporting the incident with the anti-Castro exiles. But there's a catch. He wrote the letter reporting the incident a week before it happened. Now, you stop in your tracks and you say, what does that mean? Perhaps there's something else behind this operation of Oswald's. Then you look at the leaflets that he was handing out and some of the pamphlets that he had in his possession when he first leafleted in New Orleans, and they bear the rubber stamp address 544 Camp Street. 544 Camp Street. I'm sorry this is labyrinthine, but evidence is evidence.
No, and it's a very interesting strand. In fact, this is a strand that Jim Garrison turned up a long time ago.
Yes, I hedge away from Mr. Garrison. However, I would say to balance the Garrison circus, as I see it, and memories of that, and before we even go on into the evidence, I would say that the Chief Counsel of the Assassinations Committee, which concluded its work last year, a very cautious and respected legal professor, has said that he believes New Orleans is the starting point for further inquiry.
That's Professor Blakey.
That's right. Now, Oswald handed out his leaflets with this interesting address, 544 Camp Street, on them. 544 Camp Street, far from being the headquarters of a leftist pro-Castro movement, had been the headquarters of the Cuban exiles anti-Castro umbrella group, which had been started by U.S. intelligence, by the CIA specifically, and by none other, indeed, than Howard Hunt, the Cuban Revolutionary Council. Now,
who was our guest on this program last Friday night, I should tell you.
Really, with another of his novels, no doubt.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And a man whose life was full of fiction. And also in that building at 544 Camp Street, and specifically at the week that Oswald was handing out his leaflets for the first time, was Guy Bannister Associates. Guy Bannister Associates was so-called detective agency. That wasn't really what it was at all. It was run by Guy Bannister, who had been here in Chicago the head of the FBI agents here for a considerable time, and in the FBI had distinguished himself with great credit in many well-known cases. He then went to New Orleans, where he became Deputy Chief of Police. And then, with his background, reportedly from naval intelligence, with his long-time standing links to U.S. intelligence, and specifically since the Cuban Revolution in the anti-Castro area, Guy Bannister set up his so-called detective agency. What he was in fact doing from that detective agency was, at a local level in New Orleans, pursuing what J. Edgar Hoover was doing on a national scale. The sort of thing you remember, penetrating left-wing groups, and that left wing meant anything to the left of Genghis Khan, to smear them, to discredit them. He was putting false students into the university in New Orleans to find out what the left-wing groups or liberal groups were doing, and if possible, to smear and discredit them. Now, no one until I did my work here had made a firm link between Oswald and Guy Bannister Associates, other than the stamp on the document, on the leaflets that Oswald was handing.
You've got a tighter link than that.
Yes, I located for the first time Bannister's former assistant and secretary, and indeed his lover, a woman called Delphine Roberts, who had never been interviewed before by any law enforcement people, and whom the Assassinations Committee had not found until I located her. She tells a story which I find is credible and startling. She says that Oswald indeed consorted with Bannister, that he came to the offices that when he handed out his leaflets, Bannister wasn't annoyed, as he might normally have been, by the news of left-wing activity in the streets, and effectively said, he's one of us.
Now, we've got Oswald on that basis linked to Bannister, and Oswald on that basis falsely representing himself as a Marxist, pro-Castro agitator or street publicist, when in fact he may well have been the exact opposite. Where does the Bannister identity lead us, or how does it lead us back to identifiable elements of the so-called intelligence community?
Well, Bannister, as I've indicated, his own background reeks of the intelligence community.
But you didn't, when you ran down his background, you did not mention CIA. You mentioned FBI, naval intelligence, and the police force of the city of New Orleans.
Yes. His name is to be found in CIA files, and it's quite clear that he was involved in anti-Castro operations from the Bay of Pigs onwards, munitions supplying and so on for the Bay of Pigs. Now, that whole Bay of Pigs operation was the child of the CIA. There's no problem there in connecting him with the CIA and the intelligence community as a whole, but there's another element to Bannister and to a man who worked in his operation called David Ferry, who featured prominently in the Garrison inquiry in New Orleans, and that is that both David Ferry and Guy Bannister were great supporters and involved with Carlos Marcello. Carlos Marcello, of course, the mafia chieftain who ruled the southern states, Louisiana specifically, and New Orleans, for organized crime at that time and to this day. He was arraigned, incidentally, just a week or so ago, a rare event for law enforcement. They have found Marcello down the years, even though he's been described as reliably as one of the 2 or 3 most powerful figures in the mafia in this country. He's proved extremely elusive down the years, has hardly ever been arrested. He's just been arrested arraigned for bribing local officials in New Orleans.
Well, we've got Oswald on this basis identified with Bannister, and if we identify with Bannister in turn with that sector of the CIA that was involved in running the Bay of Pigs, setting up, as Howard Hunt acknowledges he helped to do, an anti-Castro refugee Cuban government, and leading the continued operation against Castro after the failure of the Bay of Pigs. If the Bannister identity leads us back to that section of the CIA, then we've got to take it from there. And the question...
His offices, indeed, had been literally a grand central station for the Cuban exiles.
Well, the question that naturally arises at this point, and we've got to pause in a second for some commercials, and I hope we can develop this directly afterwards, is if we focus on that sector of the CIA, and perhaps it has to be more clearly defined and identified in terms of some of the leading persons involved, what purpose might they have been serving? What goals might they have been pursuing in helping to engineer the assassination of the then President of the United States? Let's pursue it from that point right after these words.
Funny continues. Again, here's Milt.
Thank you very much, George Bauer. Anthony, I must, as Hamlet says to his mother, be cruel to be kind, or rather, I must be schematic and oversimplify to push us toward the kind of lucidity that might be achieved on a radio program. We cannot do full justice.
I hope so. I was beginning to feel as we were talking there before the break that although we were talking about important evidence, it must have been terribly difficult for listeners to follow us through that part of the labyrinth without having read the book.
No, I don't think so. We've got intelligent listeners, and I'm sure they're following, and you speak as well as you write, but obviously you can't get into as much detail when you talk on a radio program as you can in a book of over 400, indeed, over 500 pages. But we've done quite well so far, but I think what we need to do is use the method of triangulation. We started with Oswald. That's one route toward the target point, namely an account of and an explanation of the assassination. We can also start with the Mafia or some elements of it, or we can start with that sector of the CIA. I propose now that we do that. What have you picked up? What did the investigating committee pick up? What else have you been able to gather as relevant evidence about that group within the CIA, whoever or whatever they are, and what they have against Kennedy, and what their earlier connections with the Mafia, with Oswald and other possible double agents and various kinds of agents, so that we can begin to understand the involvement of that renegade element of the CIA in this great tragedy. Let's start in Langley, if that's where we have to go. I'm not sure.
One of the important points that you raised, you touched on earlier, is that we must not go too far down Paranoia Gulch and talk about the CIA being involved in the assassination. I think we've been making that clear, but I'd like to labor the point. We're talking about the possible involvement in the assassination and the involvement with Oswald of a renegade element within the CIA.
Well, what does one really mean by renegade element?
Well,
were they no longer in the employ of the CIA?
No, I believe that the people who we shall touch on specifically in a moment or two were still in the employ of the CIA. Now, at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, of course, came the Bay of Pigs crisis, and everything in this story hinges, turns on, comes back to Cuba time and time again. After the Bay of Pigs, which was, of course, a fiasco and in which President Kennedy had been ill-advised by his military advisors and by his intelligence advisors, which included the CIA. Kennedy is reported to have talked of wishing to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. There were, of course, important changes at the top of the CIA, but one has to stress that, of course, also, that even after the appointment of Kennedy appointee Director McCone, that at most levels of the CIA, of course, patriotic men went on doing their patriotic duty. However, many...
Tony, a moment's interruption. I've got to do my duty. This is WGN Radio from Chicago. Sorry for the interruption. Please proceed.
However, there were those in the CIA who bitterly resented Kennedy policy and also bitterly resented Robert Kennedy's involvement. As Attorney General, he was appointed by his brother to oversee activities involving Cuba from the time of the Bay of Pigs fiasco onwards. This was the time of the secret war. Before President Kennedy changed tack, he was concerned that there should be a pinprick war, if you like, a build-up of raids, of propaganda, a secret war against Castro's Cuba to undermine the revolution. Now, this war was run under the oversight of a special group on Cuba, chaired on many occasions by Robert Kennedy, and managed in the field by CIA operational officers. One of the operational officers at this time was a man called William Harvey. William Harvey came to hate Robert Kennedy with a purple passion. He, for example, jumping a year or so, at the time of the missile crisis, William Harvey, at a time when most of us were convinced that the world was about to lurch over the edge into nuclear warfare, perhaps one of the most dangerous times in world history, when President Kennedy and his advisors, including his brother, were closeted in the White House, teetering along that brink of war. William Harvey took it into his head to send several groups of Cuban exile invaders into Cuba as assault parties, commando teams. Robert Kennedy found out about this in the middle of the crisis, and of course it was a horrendous shock what the sending in of commando teams in the middle of the missile crisis might have done in terms of turning the thing in an even more perilous direction. It was horrendous to contemplate. Now, that's the sort of thing. It was, perhaps you could say, it was just foolhardy. But there are other indications that CIA officers were going their own way, doing things that were directly contrary to presidential policy. For example, jumping back to the Bay of Pigs, we find credible evidence that from, indeed, the leader of the Cuban military arm of the invasion force. He says that just when they were about to go off on the invasion and about to board the ships and the planes and so on, it wasn't certain whether the go-ahead from the invasion would come from the White House.
And just to keep the dramatis personae clear, what was his name?
You caught me there. San Ramon.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, he says that as they were waiting to know whether they were going to get the go from the White House or not, they were called together by one of the CIA advisors who was running the operation, a man called Frank Bender, and that Frank Bender told the exile leaders that if the word from the White House was to be no go, don't go ahead, then the exile leaders were to pretend, mark you, to take the CIA advisors prisoner. But the CIA advisors would in fact give them all the information they needed to go ahead with the operation, the code words, the maps, that sort of information, and to go ahead with the operation anyway. Now, that obviously is, by implication, a readiness to totally subvert presidential policy if it became necessary.
So the old CIA argument that you can't blame us for any of the nasty things we do, we are just the agents of the President and the National Security Council, we do only what we are directed to do, that
it doesn't wash in terms of those particular times and the activities that were going on at that time. Now, I think we move into deeper water and a very serious area here, and that is the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. There is no question, we know from congressional investigations in the last 10 years, that there were such plots, that they were directed by the CIA, and that the CIA plunged into the folly of using mafia leaders,
including a notable Chicagoan who has since gone to his reward, Sam Giancana.
Of using the mafia in the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, it is clear that although Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, may have learned of one of the earlier phases of these plots, as it were, after the event, and apparently he was extremely annoyed about it, and although President Kennedy may have learned that there was some thought of trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, my research leaves me convinced that in the year before the assassination, President Kennedy and his brother, neither of them knew anything about such a thing, yet without even the knowledge of the director of the CIA, McCone, let alone the presidency, CIA officers at a senior level were pushing ahead with other schemes to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Well, that
folly, you might call it. You could also call it subversion.
You can call it both folly and subversion, and you can also call it a violation of their mandate, but that was water over the bridge by the time of the assassination, water over the dam. Right?
Now I think we should come to specific evidence which leads us to Oswald and the assassination, and points in a way that I found most disquieting. This is the most disquieting, troubling single item of evidence that I found involving U.S. intelligence. It turns on the allegation by the leader of Alpha 66, which at the time was one of the most militant, aggressive, anti-Castro guerrilla groups working out of Florida and the American coastline against Cuba. Now, the former leader of Alpha 66, a man who was publicly known for his zealous fight against Fidel Castro down the years, has said in the last 2 or 3 years that in 1963, in those tinderbox months after the missile crisis, his U.S. intelligence case officer, who he knew only by his cover name of Morris Bishop, was deliberately instigating Alpha 66 raids against Soviet ships on the Cuban coastline and Soviet installations as an attempt to cause further friction between Moscow and Washington. Now, the raids took place. That's a historical fact. President Kennedy and the State Department immediately upped and said nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the United States. Khrushchev, meanwhile, was rattling his sabers. Castro was going into his typical harangues. And no sooner had the president denied knowledge or involvement than the leader of Alpha 66 and his colleagues upped and said it was us and we did it from Florida. Extremely embarrassing for the United States and very dangerous at that time. So you have here evidence that Maurice Bishop
and his people to fabricate proof that Oswald was
involved with communist Cuban intelligence and diplomats. Now, this is a crucial area. We're now about to get into the area of disinformation. But perhaps before we do that, I could just say how one can interpret that evidence. If we take in 3 levels of gravity, the first allegation that he saw his U.S. intelligence case officer with Oswald, of course, suggests merely a connection between Oswald and U.S. intelligence, which doesn't necessarily predicate any U.S. intelligence involvement in the assassination. Then, of course, you have the second level of gravity, which is that the U.S. intelligence case officer was deliberately trying to use the assassination to a black propaganda advantage. Well, that's a serious accusation which would merit investigation anyway. But again, it doesn't necessarily suggest involvement in the assassination itself, unless you put it against the earlier evidence that this same case officer had been involved since the spring of that year in deliberate and serious military attempts to subvert presidential policy. When you take all those facets of the thing into account, then you have to allow for the very real possibility that this element of U.S. intelligence was in fact involved in the conspiracy to assassinate the president.
To jump ahead, as I think we need to get the structure of the argument, to go beyond the evidence for a moment, I've got to ask you, and I give you again a few minutes to prepare your answer because we've got some commercials that are due almost instantly. I have to ask you to begin to impute motive or strategic plan. If this section of the CIA, the one that was closely involved in mounting the Bay of Pigs and then in the aftermath of Bay of Pigs remained in close contact with the anti-Castro Cubans now resident in the United States, if they were...
And with the Mafia, of course.
And with the Mafia, and then went on to use Oswald and many others to stage that assassination and to do a general disinformation operation about the assassination so as to veil its true purposes and its origins. If all of that happened, but if it originates somehow with that group of renegade CIA people, one must, of course, ask, why did they want to do it? What goal were they pursuing? Similarly, one would have to ask, how did the Mafia elements who were drawn in see this as advantageous to their interests? And how did the anti-Castro Cubans see it as serving their cause? It's time, I think, to make that imputation, recognizing that it is mere speculation, and we'll turn to that right after these words.
Again, here's Milt Rosenberg.
Thank you very much, George. My guest tonight is Anthony Summers, or as his friends undoubtedly call him back in London, Anthony, who is the author of the new book, Conspiracy, and that's just published by McGraw-Hill. I put the question to you a moment ago. What motives were being served if, indeed, this element of the CIA, together with some elements of the Mafia and of the anti-Castro Cuban community in this country, conspired to kill the president? How could killing the president serve their purposes?
Can we take the mob first? Because I think so far in this program we've been talking a great deal about the intelligence aspects of the thing. I think the intelligence aspects cannot be ignored. On the other hand, the evidence of Mafia involvement is very heavy indeed, and I'd like to emphasize that. Mob motive. Under the Kennedy administration, organized crime in this country was under pressure, on the run, as it never had been before or never has been since.
Robert Kennedy, indeed, was after them, and he wrote a book about how they were a menace to the country, and he dedicated himself to pursuing them to prison.
Yes, some would say he was almost obsessed with the war against the mob in the unions, specifically Jimmy Hoffa, of course, was almost his personal vendetta, a vendetta which paid off after the assassination of John Kennedy, when Hoffa was sent to jail at last. Now, after, as Hoffa put it, shooting fish in a barrel, which was his way of talking about jury tampering for a very long time. Now, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General under his brother's presidency, was pursuing the mob as never before, and the figures really are startling in this. In 1960, the year before President Kennedy came to power, there were 33 organized crime convictions in this country, and in the last 6 months and the 6 months after the Kennedy presidency, there were more than 600. The mob was on the run. The middle level of organized crime, middle management, if you like, was actually talking about going back to Italy. It was that bad. And Attorney General Robert Kennedy had specifically targeted individual mafia leaders for Justice Department attention. Sam Giancana, whom we mentioned earlier in this program, was being pursued so relentlessly by the FBI that he couldn't go golfing without having an FBI team golfing on the tee behind him. Carlos Marcello, whom we've also mentioned, in fact, they're in New Orleans, which of course is highly relevant to the activities of Oswald, as we saw just before the assassination. Carlos Marcello was also being heavily pursued and was, in fact, literally thrown out of the country by Robert Kennedy. He was not a U.S. citizen. He is not a U.S. citizen to this day. And Carlos Marcello, who the Justice Department would like to have deported, the courts system failed, and Robert Kennedy found a way to have the man put on an aircraft, flown out of the country to Guatemala, whence he shortly returned. He got back into the country secretly and was soon fairly openly around New Orleans again. And it's interesting here to put in brackets that he was probably flown back into the country by David Ferry. David Ferry was a person who worked with Guy Bannister at that address in New Orleans we were talking about, and his paths appear to have crossed with Oswald's, both in Oswald's youth, when Ferry was running a sort of air cadet corps locally, and at that time in the summer of 1963. Ferry was deeply involved as a so-called investigator for Carlos Marcello.
If we get back to the question of intrinsic motive, which might have activated the assassination attempt, what you're saying with regard to the mafia or elements of the mafia is that their motive was very simple. They wanted to get this suddenly very heavy federal monkey or federal gorilla off their backs, and the best way to do that was to send a cautionary message, and nothing would be more cautionary than killing the president.
Well, I'm coming to a specific allegation about Carlos Marcello.
All right.
Carlos Marcello, after he got back into the country, of course, he was back, but he had been humiliated as mafia leaders are not humiliated by being thrown out of the country.
And they are, we know, men of honor.
Oh, men of great honor. From an indisputably dishonorable heritage. Carlos Marcello, it is alleged, by somebody who was involved and associated with the Marcello circle, that is without question. It is alleged that Carlos Marcello, in the fall of 1962, at a private meeting, discussed murdering the president, talked as if there was a plan already afoot to do so, that he was involved in it. And he talked about it using an analogy. He said, if you want to get hold of the tail or take off the tail of a dog, meaning Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, then the way to do it in this case is to cut off the head, meaning the president. And he talked, it is alleged, of using a patsy to take the blame. Now, this allegation was brought forward in 1967, incidentally, by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Ed Reed, expert on the mafia, who had learned it in turn from the witness. And the response of the FBI, whose director, J. Edgar Hoover, had been had told the Warren Commission that for the Bureau the case would be open for all time. The FBI, in fact, responded to this very serious allegation by trying very hard indeed to discredit not only the witness but also the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. Now, back to motive. The mob was, apart from its defensive situation against the onslaught from the Kennedy administration, was also deeply involved in Cuban operations. It had been in Havana involved in an organized crime business which was more important financially than Vegas. Havana had been effectively the capital of the underworld. That
because of their gambling involvement or other
gambling,
rackets
prostitution, drugs, the whole gamut that covers organized crime.
And Batista let them skim all they wanted, of course.
That's right. And about a year after the Castro Revolution, people like Santos Traficante, who to this day, who ran ran Cuban rackets and has since been in Florida running rackets out of Florida, were detained by Fidel Castro and eventually removed from the country, and organized crime operations in Havana had come to an end. That is why, with the hope of returning one day to their lucrative hunting grounds in Cuba, that is why the Mafia found itself firmly on the anti-Castro side, lined up with the anti-Castro Cuban exiles and with the CIA, which, as we've seen in its folly, turned to the Mafia to help in its attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Let me pick up on something right there. That suggests that the view in the anti-Castro group, not the Mafia group, but the anti-Castro Cuban refugees, and the view among their friends in that renegade element of the CIA, who were equally anti-Castro, that the view there was that somehow we foster the downfall of Castro and the return of a non-Marxist government to Cuba if we kill the President of the United States. But I don't see how that logic goes.
No, right. Now, the anti-Castro Cuban motive, and I think one has to link together the anti-Castro Cuban motive and the motive of their intelligence backers, the possible motive there to get rid of the president, as followed, and this is tremendously shorthand, but we'll do our best. After the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy was perceived by many in the anti-Castro movement as having betrayed the Cuban cause. We talked earlier about Howard Hunt, chief political officer for the Bay of Pigs, until just before it went ahead. He talks of sitting in the war room at the CIA, listening to the reports coming in of the fiasco on the beaches in Cuba, and of the deep resentment against the president for not putting in the support that from the United States armed forces that might have assured a successful landing at the Bay of Pigs.
An important element there is the withdrawal of air cover that originally had been scheduled, as I remember.
Well, there's great discussion over whether it had originally been scheduled or not, yes, but the failure to supply air cover, which might have helped on the beaches. Now, Howard Hunt specifically lays the blame for that failure on a man he perceived as a wrong-headed, weak President Kennedy. Now, the anti-Castro movement's feeling that it had been betrayed by President Kennedy, and this word betrayal was a word much bandied about, was reinforced at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when most of us, I think, perceived President Kennedy as a Western hero who had faced up to Khrushchev over the missiles. The anti-Castro movement understood this, but it also understood that he had given assurances to Khrushchev that the United States would not invade Cuba. That was an extension of the betrayal for them. Then, through the spring and summer of 1963, and now we're into that period, parallel with Oswald's visits to New Orleans and those shenanigans we were talking about earlier, President Kennedy started to firmly clamp down on exile raids, which up to then had been backed by U.S. intelligence. That the customs people, the immigration people had given their blessing to the boats setting off from the Florida Keys on their way to their raids against Cuban shores. All those forces of the government were now turned against the exiles to stymie their operations, to stop them. Further extension of betrayal. And then, and this is something that I get into far more in my book than has previously been done, I think this is potentially terribly important. President Kennedy had given the go-ahead to a secret dialogue with Fidel Castro aimed at reaching a peaceful accommodation over Cuba.
And Ambassador Atwood, if I remember the name correctly, was involved in that, representing our side.
Yes, he had appointed Ambassador William Atwood, who later became chairman of Newsday magazine in this country, but at that time was an ambassador at the UN for the Kennedy administration. He was appointed to conduct the first tentative, careful connections with Fidel Castro's people. And remember, this was at a time when there had been a virtual state of war for years, ever since 1960. Now, Atwood made, President Kennedy stipulated specifically that these talks should be kept secret, and kept secret from the CIA and from the State Department bureaucracy. It seems extremely probable that the information about the talks in fact did leak, and to the CIA and to the anti-Castro movement. Atwood, incredibly, conducted a number of his contacts with the Cubans by open telephone line from the apartment of an ABC reporter in Manhattan, from telephone calls from Manhattan to Havana. Now, open telephone calls to Havana were, as they no doubt are now, monitored by the National Security Agency, which does such things. And at the top of the distribution list for transcripts of such calls would have been, of course, CIA and the anti-Castro departments of the CIA. Now, he also held his conversations with the Cubans at the UN. Now, the UN was and is, I'm sure, bugged, but it certainly was then. That is well known. And it's almost a joke at the United Nations. It was bugged by U.S. intelligence. And as the historian Arthur Schlesinger has observed, it's almost certain that the CIA knew that Ambassador Atwood and the Cubans were not merely exchanging daiquiri recipes.
So,
now,
on this basis...
The talks leak, and if they had leaked to the anti-Castro people and their U.S. intelligence supporters, this would have replaced mere resentment. It would have presented for the first time a specific operational reason to stop an ongoing process. And the only way to stop it was to stop the man who was entirely in control of it, which was President Kennedy.
Cut off the head.
This is speculation, but I've speculated here with the agreement in my speculation by people like Schlesinger and Ambassador Atwood.
Well, you've traced the possible motivations and the background for those motivations with great sharpness. We're going to develop much more of the evidence and your view of the evidence as we go on to the telephones tonight. And I might pause for a moment to invite telephone calls now. The lines are open. The number, as usual, is 591-7200. 591-7200. The area code for long-distance calls is, as ever, 312.